In 1990, Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. This law protects the civil rights of people with disabilities. The ADA makes the government, employers, and other public services responsible for protecting the rights of these people with disabilities and has led to equal access to employment, public transportation, and better treatment. The ADA has made a positive impact on the world because of its help towards people with disabilities that make them feel more part of the people within the community. Before the ADA was created, people who wanted to help make life better for people with disabilities often misunderstood their needs. They thought to fix the problem, they forced many of these people with disabilities to live away from the rest of the community. Another issue was that keeping people with disabilities separate, communities understood them less and less, and their issues and challenges started becoming more visible. Throughout history, the discrimination against these individuals led to mistreatment and abuse. In the 1930s and 1940s, people with disabilities were some of the first to be harmed and killed when the Nazi Party came to power in Germany. In the United States, people with disabilities were forced to have surgeries that prevented them from having children. While people with disabilities began to be able to move more easily in the 1970s, they still faced discrimination in regard to education and employment. Public schools could legally refuse to enroll disabled children, and special schools for the blind and deaf were also segregated from the community. Over the years, people with disabilities and their families began to speak out against injustice, and activist groups began to form.
So I went to my high school in Spencer, which was not accessible. It was on 2 levels. And my dad, who was the school attorney, told the superintendent, yes, he would go back to school in Spencer. So they carried me up and down 2 sets of 10 steps each to get to my classes in the upper levels and back down again at the end of the day. So much different with the passage of the ADA. Of course, not that everything was perfect after that, but it certainly changed the mindset of a lot of people about what their responsibilities were in terms of people with disabilities and how they were supposed to treat and react towards the issues that they had, the barriers that were there.
You may think movements start with one great leader, but that's not always the case. The disability rights movement, like other civil rights movements, has many people who fought many battles over many years. They are all part of how the ADA started. Ed Roberts was an American activist and played a big role in the creation of the ADA. He helped with many other movements which inspired the ADA to be advocated. Without him, the ADA might have taken longer to materialize or might not have been as comprehensive. As a young senator, Tom Harkin was inspired by Senator Ted Kennedy to create a legislation to protect the civil rights of millions of Americans with physical and mental disabilities. Senator Harkin knew firsthand about the challenges facing people with disabilities from his brother, Frank, who had been deaf since an early age. What he created emerged into a process and would later become one of the senator's most important legislative achievements, the Americans with Disabilities Act. In April 1988, Senator Lowell Waker of Connecticut and Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa introduced the legislation envisioned by the National Council on Disabilities, the Americans with Disabilities Act. After its public hearing, it focused attention on the need for comprehensive legislation. It became the blueprint for the Americans with Disabilities Act and started the momentum for future legislative action. There has even been a movie created based on the Americans with Disabilities Act. It is about a guy named Richard Pennimal who joins the war and loses most of his hearing. He has come from a complicated family and tries to find things he likes to do to be able to go to college and fulfill his life. He then meets a guy that has cerebral palsy who is the only person he can understand with his bad hearing. They become great friends and go everywhere together. But wherever they go, they get criticized or kicked out. Richard then discovers his gift for motivational speaking and becomes an advocate for people with disabilities.
2 years ago, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed through Congress. And last week, it became a reality. Who did that?
President George H.W. Bush signs landmark legislation prohibiting the discrimination of people with disabilities in all areas of public life, including jobs, schools, transportation, and all public and private places that are open to the general public. The ADA gives civil rights protections to individuals with disabilities similar to those provided to individuals on the basis of race, color, gender, national origin, age, and religion.
Three weeks ago, we celebrated our nation's Independence Day, and today we're here to rejoice in and celebrate another Independence Day, one that is long overdue, and with today's signing of the landmark Americans for Disabilities Act, every man, woman, and child with a disability can now pass through once closed doors into a bright new era of equality, independence, and freedom. And as I look around at all these joyous faces, I remember clearly how many years of dedicated commitment have gone into making this historic new Civil Rights Act a reality. It's been the work of a true coalition.
The areas of improvements after the ADA was signed were access to buildings, greater inclusion of people with disabilities in the community, and an increase in public sensitivity and awareness, showing that the ADA has improved life for the better and has given many rights. In passing the ADA, Congress intended to eliminate discrimination in the workplace and create more employment opportunities for individuals with disabilities given by businesses. According to the most recent U.S. Census Bureau statistics, 25.4% of people work with a disability. The changes made because of the ADA have not only impacted the U.S., it has impacted countries around the world. Since 2000, at least 181 countries have passed disability civil rights laws similar to the ADA. The ADA has made a positive impact on the world, and while it did take a long time for it to be established, when it did, it truly changed people's lives.
The areas that have been slow to come along, comparatively speaking, are healthcare, housing, and community services and supports. Clearly, these are the areas that we need to work on the hardest, not only because they're the areas we've made the least progress in, but they're the areas now that have the greatest demand in terms of the need for assuring full participation by seniors and people with disabilities going forward.
I can go into any new building and still find barriers. There are new issues that we're confronting. We still have a low employment rate for people with disabilities. We have to solve that. We have to figure out how we can get reasonable accommodation.
While there are still improvements to be made, the changes the ADA has brought about are a hopeful sign of what can happen when we work together to make our society equal, open, and accessible to all.